right. I guess to start off to frame this thing, I did want to. I'll get Vienno to tell us what the sort of like reasons or a bit of a synopsis,
Background.
yeah, before we break into it. But I also wanted to flag just in the front that I don't know. I had some thoughts when reading this, which is that I am not as well read on, I guess, current or some like more recent or up to date writings on anti-colonialism. And so
Mhm.
I just wanted to flag that, I mean, like, for one, me and Vienna are not indigenous, we are settlers. And also, I'm not going to speak on authority about this. So I want this to be taken in the spirit of all of us, including you in the chat, joining us on a journey where we can learn stuff about this, right? But like, I am definitely not an authority on this. I just wanted to flag that right up front.
Just one thing real quick. Can you resize
Yes.
the article? Because it's not very visible on the stream right now, especially like audio size.
Yeah, there we go.
Um, and also it's kind of like your camera's blocking a lot of it, and also the like voice chat
Yep.
thing
But
is like right block. Okay, you can just like move that.
yeah,
Can you do that for the camera?
can I do that for the camera? Yes, but I'm wondering, is this gonna end eventually? Yeah. Maybe chat box. Move it up a little bit. It's fine that way. Like, I mean, we're gonna scroll up and read it in chunks, so I don't think my camera's gonna be too chunky. But yeah. Anything else, or do you want to get straight to the synopsis of what we're about to read?
Yeah. So the article is like primarily, um, like it's largely US focused, but I still think it carries a lot of weight for Canadian issues as well, um, because, you know, Indigenous people have been displaced and talked over and used as props by, you know, so-called communist parties or socialist parties or whatever for a long time. But this article is like primarily focused around the American Party, the Party for Socialism and Liberation, and it gets a little bit into like talking about specific program aspects that they have. Um, but I think that they like hold a decent amount of weight when discussing things about Canada as well, um, because in many ways the kind of like more Marxist Leninist left is still act as like colonial parties, um, especially if they engage in electoralism, where it's like they are still engaging with the system of like domination and exploitation and displacement of indigenous people and, you know, attempted annihilation of indigenous people and their like claims to live in North America / Turtle Island, where, you know, they are still acting as this sort of like colonial force.
I was just gonna
And
add to that,
honestly, like,
just in terms of like taking out of the American context, is like, and this obviously not. I mean, we're going to be talking about how the NDP does some crappy things too in a bit as well when we get to the next article. But we've had problems in Canada with our own the Communist Party of Canada having
mhm.
bad takes in terms of indigeneity and colonialism. So it's not just a American centric thing, even though this article, I think it's in Tennessee. This article is based on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so. Um, but yeah, like, and further, like with communist and socialist parties generally, like they are primarily founded and the main membership and even like the goals of future membership is targeted around settler groups. Um, and, you know, they might be, some of them are, you know, less white at least than others, but that is still like their main and primary focus is this sort of like settler industrial people who want slightly better lives, but don't necessarily like care about indigenous people. um, but yeah, it's a good article.
Only other thing I'll flag before we get into it is there's going to be some, I think, Aztec names that I'm going to butcher. I'm just going to just going to flag that right up front. That I'm going to try my best, but I'm likely going to mess that up. I mean, there's probably other words I'm going to mess up too. I generally butcher even the English language, so just it is what it is.
Mm-hmm.
All right, the Reds and the Reds: How Communists Fail Indigenous Nations. Indigenous Nations. See, I already slurred my speech. By Andrea or Andrea. So I'm just going to read it. The original Red Menace was not the Red Russian, but the Red Race. The colonization of K. Right at the start. Kayawita or Turtle
Sure.
Island is a process that seeks to eliminate indigenous people from the continent and steal their land. It was obvious to those who first colonized this place that they needed the land, but they didn't take it without explaining why they deserved it. They needed a justification as their philosophical base demanded so. And so they found justification for their theft in the Dominican theologian Francisco de Vitoria. All of this work was done within liberalism, but communists, never wanting to be outdone by liberals, also have looked to find a way to justify their workers' state founded upon the same stolen land as the bourgeois state so long ago. The question is one of land. Although indigenous people know that the land is rightfully ours, we must watch as liberals and communist settlers make justifications of their states, both actually existing and merely wished for, upon our land. Let us explore these justifications. So that was a bit of a primer. I don't know if there's too much to go into there, unless you want to add any thoughts, Piano.
Yeah, I don't really have anything.
De Vitoria was one of the premier theologians of colonization who determined its legal boundaries after the invasions of Axcantelahuatloyan, the Aztec Empire. I hope that was pretty good. By Hernan Cortez, and Tiwanatinsuyu, the Incan Empire, by Francisco Pizarro, along with the invasions of other nations by later conquistadors. Before we explore De Vitoria's thought, we must remember the role that law plays in our lives. Evgeny Pashkanis says, law represents the mystified form of a specific social relation. I often say as well that a lot of people, especially liberals, tend to think that the law is magical. So that I do like this quote.
Yeah. Yevgeny Pashkanis was a like
The name sounds so familiar.
He was really active in the early social democratic left, like early Marxism, like turn of the 20th century, and he wrote a book that I can't find physically anywhere, called Law and Marxism, which explored, because Marx talks a lot about how the form of value and the forms of money and like these sorts of things are like a foundational aspect of capitalism. And Pashkanis went into the legal form, how as a social form that is enacted by just kind of like existing and accepting that it is at some level normal or natural, the law sort of enacts itself upon our lives. And I really want a copy, but they're like $50.
That's hidden books, $50 is always a lot for a book.
Yeah, if anybody follows Radical Reprints on Twitter, they're a like book reprinting collective. Please bully them on Twitter, and tell them to print some of these so that we can have a new publication, because I don't think that they've been published since like the 80s, which is why it's so fucking expensive. Yeah, I just really want a copy of this book.
I will not seek to explain in its full entirety the material process of settler colonialism, as these processes have already been expanded upon by an innumerable amount of authors. What I will explore is the legal mystification of the social process of settler colonialism. It was interesting because like I had just recently did a an interview with Progressive American, and you can check that out on
Yeah, I
their
watched it.
YouTube thing as well. But like one of the questions that he asked was about the legality aspect of it. And I was also like, I don't think we should be talking in a legal framework. Uh,
Hmm.
we need to ignore that in part because it's like they the liberal order does not. I mean, they like to have they talk about the legal order as if it's this magical thing, and yet they tend to just ignore it when it is most convenient for them anyways. So I think it's I mean, I do think it's really important to understand the law in many ways, especially for a lot of local actions that you can't do on larger scales, but I think we need to also think more critically about the law rather than just assuming it is an innate structure to our system that must be uh, preserved at all costs or something like this. It can be rethought of critically and redesigned or removed and replaced if all that is necessary.
Abolish all legalisms.
Yeah. De Vittoria determined that Indians are not in point of fact madmen, but have judgment like other men. In this context, we can understand judgment as reason, reason allowing them dominion, which is to say, ultimate title, over their own land. A lack of reason is the same reason why a woman, for example, was unable to hold land. The goal of the Spanish through de Vitoria was to ensure a legality of conquest. De Vitoria recognized the humanity of Indians, but still needed to find ways through which to justify the conquest of their lands and the Spanish possession of dominion over them. There were several ways that he did this. If an Indian nation refused the right of the Spanish to travel through their territory or refused the Spanish the right to trade with Indians, Indian nations were acting against the law of nations, or ius gentium. Acting against ius gentium was to act against reason itself. This would render Indians mad and allow the Spanish to declare dominion over the land that the Indians occupied. They could claim dominion because the Spanish were required to set up a civil society in order to teach the Indians how to be reasonable. In more direct terms, this meant that the Spanish had the right to intervene in the lives of Indians, an intervention that would result in the loss of tens of millions of lives. And again, you can see aspects of this in our own uh, genocide of the indigenous people in Canada. This idea of somehow like changing indigenous people to be more like us. You know, it sounded like you were going to say something there. You know,
Um, Sorry, I had to mute because a loud car went by. But yeah, like the very obvious is that quote. Is it John A. MacDonald who said it? I honestly don't remember. But always a like it's always said like in reference to residential schools is the kill the Indian to save the child, like as the sort of founding ethos of what the residential schools existed to do. And that's later once we get to residential schools, that's you know there were wars of extermination well before that type
yeah.
of thing.
There's also something that was said here that kind of like interests other projects I've worked on, which is this idea of like, so it says here that a woman lacked reason, which is why they could not be landholders. And that actually like goes
Mhm.
back to Aristotle. Like a lot of this shit goes back to Aristotle, sadly. Uh, because
Fuck that dude.
I know Aristotle had a view about women, which was that uh, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it was basically his idea was that women, because they're really deficient men, are cold blooded, where like men are vigorous and warm blooded. So therefore, because their blood is cold, women don't have the ability to reason. And so a lot of this goes all the way fucking back to Aristotle, including like as you'll notice what I said there, as women being the deficient form of men. there's some evidence. I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before. A book by an individual named Thomas Lacker, who wrote an awesome book called Making Sex. And the thesis of that book is that Aristotle thought there was only one sex rather than the binaristic model that we sort of inherited from vaguely the Enlightenment, if his picture is correct. And the idea was,
Mm.
so because women were deficient, he actually, one way that he provided evidence for this is the case that Aristotle thought this way and that it sort of like perpetuated itself, was that if you look at anatomical drawings of women from closer to Aristotle's time as opposed to ours, they were perfect or purposefully designed to look more like penises than they were vaginas in order to fit. So they added things to the women's anatomy to make it look more like penises, which is
Gross.
which is just like fascinating how like I mean, we're in the field here where we're talking about some sort of like justification for how the system justifies its dominion over another people, and it's based on really bizarre and out there theories from someone several millennia ago who just thought this. It wasn't
Yeah.
justified on anything, it was just their thought, you know? And that's wild to me.
I wonder, like, I don't know. I'd really like to study the Roman legal system more at some point. Um, to I guess like see how it differed, because like so much of it is still like around today. Like there's a reason that all of our legal precepts are based in Latin.
Yeah.
But
I was gonna
like
say we get worried though. All of a sudden you start using like Roman statue avatars in your in your Twitter
oh
profile.
God, no, no statues allowed. Destroy all statues. Um, no idols here, thanks. Um, but like just to kind of like go into like so how so much of it like is still sort of thought of as like, oh yeah, this is just like how things are. Like it was Rome that mandated monogamy first,
Interesting.
like legally, and that was I think still in Republican times, and then in like the 200s or 300s, they were the ones who mandated it for Jewish people within the empire, and um, like so monogamy in like sort of European Jewish populations was originally because of a Roman legal thing, and just like how that
Yeah.
tying into colonialism, tying into like the displacement of people and everything like that, where like all of those sorts of things you can sort of see like the grains of, even if it's not the exact same back then. And it's just like, damn, if only like Pompeii had been a bit bigger or something, like maybe we wouldn't have this bullshit.
Yeah. No, it is fascinating.
Or it'd just be a different language. Who
Yeah.
knows?
Yeah, who knows? There's only one tape. We can't rewind and start again.
Hmm.
I'll keep reading here. There was also another opportunity through which the Spanish could acquire dominion over Indian land. Although De Vitoria asserted that Indians possessed reason, he then posited the possibility that these barbarians, though not totally mad, are nevertheless so close to being mad that they are unsuited to setting up or administering a commonwealth, both legitimate and ordered in human and civil terms. I mean, it's interesting with this De Vitoria character because I think there's a part that what you're getting here that they sort of asserted in the last paragraph as well, that he sort of saw indigenous people of like not being holy, I guess in the phraseology used in his term, like mad. And so it's like, I don't know, it's wondering like how much of this was him still trying to justify them taking the land, or I don't know. I wish beyond this article, I want to know more about this Vittoria person and how he struggled
Yeah.
with some of these weird claims. You know?
I mean, I also think that it's kind of important when looking at a lot of these framings, and it's just like it's such a like monumentally fucked up time in history. when like when the discovery, when like Columbus like finally shows up, type of thing. Um, because like 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue, type of thing. 1492 was also the end of the Reconquista in Spain. So the last Muslim city, the last city where like you could be anything other than Catholic, was taken by the Spanish crown in 1492. So it's just like it's the same sort of like the Spanish have been in a semi-genocidal war with like various Muslim polities for like 300-400 years at this point. And the second that that is over, they have all of these like conquistadors. And they're called conquistadors because they conquered Spain.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, and the original like crews of like a lot of these people were from the Reconquista, where they were used to already like dehumanizing people and enslaving people and forcibly converting them and like all of these sorts of things. And then those lessons get applied on a even larger scale when they sail across the ocean. And it's just kind of like interesting how that sort of interplays with the dehumanization of Muslims and like the start of like slavery and like all of those sorts of things as well, where it's just kind of like this confluence that all happens in the space of like 50 to 75 years.
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. I continue. This would mean that in
Yeah.
lacking reason, they lacked a basic precondition for ownership. Indians did not even have to break the law of nations. They could simply be found to be so deficient in reason that they lacked the ability to claim dominion over their land. Although they lacked reason, Europeans would be able to grant them reason through the teachings of the good book. So, yeah, just throw Bibles at
Yep.
them. As Robert Williams Jr. says, only Christian Europeans could offer the Indians a rationalized existence, which the Indians, by the law of nations, were obliged to accept. Not just obliged, forced. What is
Mhm.
important to remember is that although Spain and the colonial powers at large may have possessed dominion over a territory, that doesn't mean that it had been settled. Indigenous people lived in their nations, which European sovereigns claimed to be under European dominion. But British settlers, soon to be US Americans, recognized one right that Indians had before the white settlement of an area, and that was the right of occupancy. Patrick Wolf defines occupancy as a right of soil or usufruct. Usufruct. That's a weird term. Understood as hunting and gathering rather than as agriculture. Agriculture. That was granted due to natives' immemorial occupancy. Therefore, although a land may have been under the dominion of the United States, Indians still had the right of occupancy and the privileges granted through it. It was only through the consummation of dominion, which is to say settlement, that this right of occupancy disappeared. Again, I almost wish, I mean, it's a short article, but it's like there's so much embedded in this where I'm like, I want to know more. You know what I mean? Like, even these like turns of phrases, like how I want to know how the shift occurred. Like, what happened in their dialogue such that they just stopped talking about occupancy and immediately went through, uh, like that the indigenous people had occupancy to now it's like we can settle them and they don't have that thing anymore.
Hmm. I mean, I think you can still see it in a lot of senses,
I
like
mean,
even with like the Wet'suwet'en or
I was just
like
gonna say this gets back to
various,
the legal thing that I was saying earlier too, right? Where it's like
yeah.
we just choose not to abide by the treaty or by this law or that law. You know, we just choose. You know.
Well, I mean, and the thing is, like in BC specifically, like, there aren't even treaties. Like
Yeah.
it is a sort of like, oh yeah, you have the right to live here until we need that land for some reason. And that's exactly what is happening with the Wet'suwet'en now, where it's like,
Resource
sure, they
expansion.
could keep their land for a little while. And yeah, residential schools we would still do to them, but we weren't sending settlers in. So it wasn't until industry needed that land or, capital needed that land that it was then like, okay, yeah, yeah, yeah. Sure, sure, you lived here forever, whatever, whatever. Now we're using it, so get fucked. Like you can still see it. You like it's still
Yeah.
it is sort of like this ongoing, ever present reality is like they force them onto smaller and smaller territories and are like, okay, yeah, you can have this. You're good. You got it. It's all, you get to live on this.
And
And
then
then
the
they
city
realize,
of
oh, there's oil under
Caledonia,
these hills.
or
Or,
the city of Caledonia
yeah,
just wants to expand, you know.
yeah. Or Oko wants to build a new golf course.
I always forget that about Oka. It's just like how embarrassingly superficial that is to display. I mean, like, not to say the other reasons aren't also superficial and embarrassing, but like golf course, that like
Yeah.
that's just like up an extra notch for me, you know?
The, the fact that we sent 2,000 more troops there than we sent in the war in Afghanistan. And it's still like, oh, it's the Oka crisis, or oh, it's like whatever. And it's like, no,
Well, look how many
that was an
troops.
act of
Yeah,
imperial war. Like
the troops.
we sent
Well, and not to
4,500
mention,
troops.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's yeah, it's terrifying. I mean, even with the golf is now a dying sport. Well, it should have been dying a long
Hell
time ago.
yeah.
I mean, even with the homeless encampments, it's the same type of like what is the police state more concerned about? Resources or gentrification? All it's like they're all part of the same problem. I guess symptoms of the same problem.
Yeah.
I will continue. The territory occupied by the British would use all of these legal and philosophical justifications to explain their right to invade hundreds of indigenous nations throughout the history of the 13 colonies in the United States. To summarize, dominion was held by the king, or later the US government, and because of this, it was only the king who was able to give out title to land. Of course, this title to land would only be given out to settlers. The only right to land that indigenous people had was that of occupancy, a right which quickly became empty and meaningless when the title to land indigenous people occupied was given out. Their houses burned down, food sources annihilated, eventually forced to die, be assimilated, or removed, the consummation of dominion. Not only did the British function using the justification of dominion and occupancy, but they also used a concept called preemption. Preemption was a concept employed by all European powers, which said that Indian nations only had the ability to be politically involved with the power that discovered them. Therefore, the Cherokee Nation could not make treaties with the Spanish or French, as they were not the power that either discovered them or had dominion over their land. That's so weird. Like, I mean, it's a weird
Yeah.
form of like paternalism.
Oh yeah. No, like it's also kind of interesting, like with I guess more in the Canadian context, where like, you look at, for example, I guess it's still the American, but the American War of Independence, where most indigenous nations sided with the British, despite them being like the main sort of colonial occupier, or colonial power. It was still like to them that they had treaty relations, to them that they could like apply to the crown to be like, hey, like, what the fuck are you guys doing? Versus like the US, where it was like they were conducting massacres while fighting for independence.
Yeah.
Like,
I read a really good book on that recently. I can't remember the title, but it's weird as well, the history of the American War of Independence and how at some of the beginning stages, like right before the War of Independence, how they were they were largely working with certain indigenous populations and then just sort of like turned their back on them completely, almost at a dime, and started killing them, even though they were their allies to, I think, fighting the French before that.
Yeah.
Yeah, can't remember the name of that book. It was a good book. It was huge. I feel like history. I mean, this history is, but I mean, part of this too also reminds me of this whole notion of like being politically involved with the power that discovered them. Also, kind of reminds me of the Indian Act, where like a lot of that was enacted to because the government of Canada was like, we're only going to work with the indigenous people if they form their own like quasi government structures that mirror our own government structures, and only through that relationship would we deal with them. We're not going to allow them autonomy and self-organization. We are going to tell them how they should. So there's part of the paternalism and the justification of like, teaching the Indian to be more reasoned, I guess, in the parlance of this article, but then also saying like, you can only interact with us by like mirroring the stuff that we already do. It's very
And it's, I mean, and one of the big things about like the Indian Act and other sort of like foundational acts of colonialism of like the Canadian state was they wanted to make sure that America didn't get control of the land first. So was still like that continuation of like, oh, whoever reaches out or contacts them first has control over their territory, basically. Um, yeah, I
here.
fucking hate Canada.
We're all terrible. Here I would like to point out that the apparent contradiction in recognizing Indian nations but claiming dominion of their land, but the United States would have a solution for this problem. The three ideas of dominion, occupancy, and preemption would eventually coalesce into a political formation that is now referred to as the domestic dependent nation. The state authority introduces clarity and stability into the structure of law, but does not create the premises for it, which are rooted in the material relations of production. This is a Pushkanis quote again. Between 1823 and 1832, three cases would be presented to the Supreme Court dealing with the political juridical status of Indian nations living in occupancy in the United States. These cases were Johnson v. McIntosh, Cherokee Nation v. Georgia, and Worcester or Worcester. I can never do the however the weird English pronunciation is of this word v. Georgia.
Worcester? I don't know.
Yeah, I think you're closer. Worcester? Yeah, it could be Worcester.
Worcester.
That's a Massachusetts thing. All decided by Chief Justice John Marshall. These three cases introduced clarity and stability into the hazy legal realm of clear colonial relations between the US and Indian nations by giving a solid form to the concept of the domestic dependent nation. As we see, the phrase is 3 words long, and each word expresses a combination of the ideas of dominion, occupancy, and preemption that we have explored beforehand. Let's take a closer look at what each word means. I'm not even familiar exactly with those three cases. I guess we're going to get into a bit of it here. Domestic signifies that the nation is not able to make arrangements of any sort with foreign nations. This reflects the idea of preemption and reinforces its reality for domestic dependent nations not able to make alliances to defend itself in the United States. Dependence signifies a relation that has been described as that of a ward to its guardian. Yeah, as I said, it's like very paternal. This is to say that Indian nations and Indian people are childlike, yeah, exactly, in character and need the care and protection that the United States offers. As the decision says, the United States treat them as an inferior race of people without the privileges of citizens and under the perpetual protection and pupillage of the government. Jesus Christ. And that was a
Mm-hmm.
Supreme Court decision. When was the Civil
Yeah.
War?
60 to 65, I think.
Okay, so this is 30 years before the Civil War.
Hmm.
Finally, we come to the
Well, I
part.
mean,
Yeah, sorry, go on.
just on the note of the Civil War, like Lincoln oversaw the largest mass execution of like non-combatants in American history, not with the leaders of the Confederacy, but with indigenous chiefs of, I believe, the Lakota nation. It was Ossetisikoan of some manner, but like I don't remember like which specific nations, but it was he oversaw the execution of 36 indigenous chiefs. Um, Lincoln was a true Republican. You're right. So it's just kind of like, and you know, Sherman with like Sherman March to the Sea and stuff like that, also like waged active war against indigenous nations. So it's like even in Civil War, these dudes couldn't stop killing indigenous people.
Yeah. This is unrelated to the article, but like in case you're wondering, like I don't know if I'm shaking or moving a lot. We went hiking this past weekend, and I got my one leg is just demolished with mosquito bites, and I am so itchy, so itchy, the whole leg. And it was weird because we didn't even. It was literally we stopped the van. We're like, oh, this looks like a nice place for a hike. I get out of the van, and it was just a million mosquitoes just went, and so I shook them off as best as I can. Other things occurred, but I got back in the van almost immediately, and still have like 20 bites on me. It was brutal.
Damn.
Needless to say, we did not hike there, but I still have the bites. I will continue. Finally, we come to the word nation. As we have seen, the sovereignty and nationhood of indigenous nations has been something constantly under attack by European powers. So why would the Supreme Court recognize Indian nationhood? The answer to this question is that nationhood was key to treaty making, and treaties were one of the primary means through which the United States was acquiring so much of its land. Patrick Wolf says this degree of ongoing compatibility between Indian dispossession and Indian sovereignty, as formulated in the Marshall decisions, obliges us to view that formulation of sovereignty as a conduit rather than an impediment to dispossession. Which is interesting in terms of the sort of like this is almost like now trying to come up with a legal way of dispossession, even though it's like again the treaties weren't themselves I mean, I guess in some cases were a means for dispossession, and in other cases were just simply dismissed and ignored whenever it suited them.
Yeah. I mean, it was both though. Like
Yeah, that's what I'm
all of
saying.
the treaties were means of dispossession and then also later ignored.
Yeah.
It wasn't a one or the other. It was often both of them at once type of thing.
Yep. Through this
Yeah.
Through this concept of the domestic dependent nation, the United States acquired a stable political judicial means through which to deal with its Indian problem. It reaffirmed the dominion of the United States, all while facilitating the treaty led expansion of the United States. There have been additional changes and reforms to federal Indian policy since the formulation of the domestic dependent nation, but this form of Indian sovereignty, and I use that word in the weakest way possible, has stayed as the basis or the base of the United States' commanding relation of the domination with US American Indians. This relationship of domination is one that forwards a logic of elimination. This logic seeks to eliminate Indian and natives from existence by using murder of Indians/natives by settlers or the police, or assimilation. This logic ensures the legitimacy of the settler colonial state by eliminating one of the primary forces that is in opposition to that very state and which demonstrates that state's illegitimacy. I want to pause on this too to state that like this is one reason why I think it is important to read indigenous works, but also engage with the indigenous community and support them. In part because they are one of the leading oppositional forces to the state. So, as leftists, a good place for you to learn about the struggle is working with indigenous groups. At least I found that myself,
Yeah.
especially in terms of the road blockades and not being afraid to just take over a road. I mean,
I mean,
I don't have that
it's one
fear
of
either,
those.
but like I just find like some, especially when we're doing the student movement stuff, a lot of people were very hesitant to do anything a little too radical. So like, should we go on a street? I don't know.
I mean, and the fact that we see that as radical is like
Right?
instead of going on the sidewalk, walking on the street was just like, God, how limited our imagination.
No, exactly. I mean, like that's why there's people that we can learn from, and they're right here. But at this point, it is necessary to move from the present to the future, from liberalism to socialism. Many socialist parties mention Indians and natives in their party programs and determine a direction for us, whether that is liberation, self determination, the right to secession, or whatever other meaningless language is used. But is this relation of domination really changed in these party programs? So this is the meat of the thing. So we've seen how in this article how liberalism and the capitalist state they used these justifications. Now the question is, to what extent is socialism liberatory, or do they sort of like continue with some of the same programs, or at least moderated versions of the similar justifications?
Yeah.
The Party for Socialism and Liberation's party program begins by stating the right of self-determination for all oppressed groups. This effectively means nothing, so let us pass on to the meat of the document. I know it's like this is like pablum. Like let's see what they actually are prescribing, right? And we will say the Party of
Yeah.
Social, the PSL, that's like the main communist party in the United States. Is that true? How would you frame PSL?
There are no communist parties in the United States is
Right.
basically the answer to that, but also like
I'm going by
they're
self-description here, but
one of the more
yeah.
prominent ones. Yeah. But what I mean is like none of them are like national.
Okay.
So it's kind of in the sense of like the Communist Party of Canada, where it's like it does have chapters kind of all over the country. None of them in the US have chapters all over. So the PSL like has probably like the most active chapters, but even then like it's still even missing like major population centers as far as I know. Um like they're kind of in, I don't know, the like Midwest is probably where they're most prominent. Um like I know Philadelphia is like one of the cities that they probably have like the largest chapter. Um but yeah, they're a like weird Marxist, which is like a derivation of Trotskyism that claims Marxism, Leninism, and it's just like a whole complicated ideological mess in that way as well. Um, but like you'll often see them as like the most prominent, like, I don't know, we've talked about like the concept of like vulgar anti-imperialists before privately, but like, they're the ones that are like, oh, the US wants to intervene in Libya or Syria or whoever else. That must mean that those governments are great and good
Yeah.
or whatever. So they're like, oh yeah, Assad, Gaddafi,
Yeah.
China, like all of that kind of bullshit. Putin, um,
Noted communist Vladimir
they're
Putin.
yeah, exactly. Um, yeah, so like they're one of those types of groups, I guess.
I'm curious as well because I know wasn't PSL their like vice president at some point was Leonard Peltier,
Um,
except that he was in prison. I think.
they Yeah, I mean, he's still in prison.
Right. I mean,
Um,
at the
they run
time
a
he was running for vice president. That's what I'm saying.
so they run under a kind of like coalition-y ticket generally. Um, and Peltier was supposed to be the vice president. He was the vice president, I think, 2016 on their ticket. But this year, or in the 2020 election, he had to like step back because of health issues. Um, they generally run under, it's like the Peace and Freedom Party or something like that. And I think like this is one of the first years that they've run independent of some other random party name. where it's just like a coalition of like different activism-y and anti-war and like socialist-y groups.
And
Yeah,
for those who don't know, I get like I
it's
mean,
weird.
you should know who he is, but Leonard Peltier, I believe he was accused of murdering a Fed. Is that correct? But like the
Yeah, so
evidence seems faint.
he was a member of the American Indian movement and was involved in the 1973 occupation of
Oh,
Wounded Knee,
oh,
site of the famous Wounded Knee massacre in the 1800s. And so AIM, the American Indian movement, occupied Wounded Knee for a period of months that got a lot of federal attention in terms of like FBI and the National Guard, and I think maybe the Army were all
okay.
showing up, and it ended up in a shootout at some point. And Leonard, I wonder if his last name's actually pronounced Peltier, or if that's just like us being Canadian
Yeah,
and seeing something that looks
I'm
French
pretty sure I've
and
heard it as
pronouncing it that
Peltier.
way.
I'm pretty sure I've heard it that way.
Okay, good. Yeah,
I don't think
I
it's
believe it, but
Peltier.
it's
I
also
don't
just like,
think I've
huh,
Peltier.
Peltier.
Yeah,
Um,
I could
but
be wrong. American in the chat.
you know, a Fed got killed in a shootout, and they were like, ah, it must have been him because he was a prominent
Member.
like well-known member of AIM, and so he's been in prison ever since, despite like flimsy evidence of him being the shooter. And I think like maybe it might have been the wrong caliber of bullet or like a bunch of other bullshit. So he was accused of like murdering an FBI agent, and I think like burying him at the occupation site as well. Um,
Yeah, I think part of the reason why I just
yeah,
wanted to say that is because like I mean obviously we're going to criticize or this article criticizes PSL and their platform in terms of whether it's fully or sufficiently anti-colonial. And I mean, not that working with indigenous activists automatically absolve you of anything. It's just like I guess also you know you compare it to like the Democratic Party and stuff like this, and I think even the article might get to it, which is like it's not necessarily a comparison factor either, right? It's like the issue shouldn't be is the PSL better at this than the Democrats. It should be yeah, but are they anti-colonial, right?
yeah,
Uh,
yeah. I mean, we can get into that later with the NDP as well, right?
yeah. Well, I will go on. The existing colonial relationships of the United States will be dissolved. Independence will be immediately granted to Puerto Rico with full reparations for colonial exploitation and the right of free travel between the US and Puerto Rico. Samoa, Guam, the Virgin Islands, and Mariana Islands will be free to exercise their right to self determination up to and including independence, with reparations and the right to free travel between the former colonies and the US mainland. Restitution, including the return of land stolen, will be provided for Native nations. Further, the socialist government will reaffirm the right of Native nations to self determination up to and including independence. Colonial relationships, in this sense, means territorial formulations of the US that are not the 50 states. It is important to recognize that the United States has hundreds of colonial relationships within the borders of its 50 states, but it is clear that the PSL does not view the situation as such. Puerto Rico is the only nation which, for unspecified reason, is granted independence without restraints. The clear reason for this is the fact that only around 1% of Puerto Rico's population is not Hispanic or Latino. This is the US Census Bureau. The rest of the island included in the program are also minority white to a large degree, either having large indigenous or arrivant populations. I'm just curious because like the one thing that I wish was sourced here is the clear reason for this. I wonder if like this has been stated by PSL activists or if it's just like what other reason could it be but this? If that's like the argument that's being made here. PSL demonstrates that it allies itself with the settler colonial and white supremacist definition of the United States as that territory where whites either make up the majority or majority minority population. For PSL, it is important to automatically ensure the independence of non white states, but independence is not surrendered to those nations which settlers have occupied to a large degree. PSL attempts to put roadblocks in the way of indigenous independence, upholding the white state. Let's take a look at those roadblocks. In regards to native nations, things become incredibly confusing. The program says that the return of stolen land will be provided for native nations. As we know, all the land on which the United States sits is stolen. I mean, that is a weird phrasing, uh,
Yeah.
considering that. And considering the fact that the program in its entirety pushes for a U.S. workers' state, we can consider a true return of stolen land to be null and void. To surrender the land means to destroy any version of the United States, whether a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie or proletariat. The word further in the next sentence and the proclamation of the possibility of independence for native nations makes these things even more confusing than they already were. Let me read that again. So the word further in the next sentence and the proclamation of the possibility of independence for native nations uh, makes things even more confusing than they already were. Where did it say further?
So the program says that the return of stolen land will be provided for native nations. And then it says further, and then talks about the idea
Right, so it's
of
like, yeah,
them being dependent, which is like, how are you giving the land back if they're not independent already?
right. If you're like, I'm stipulating something after giving the land back to you, then it's no longer, you're still stipulating things to them.
Mhm.
It would seem that the program would like further to indicate even stronger steps towards independence, but what it actually indicates is steps backwards. We are told that land will be returned in the previous sentence, but then told that independence isn't assured, as the workers' state has the final say in our independence. How does the workers' state have the final say? The program specifies the right of native nations to self determination. Rights are something that are given and upheld by some entity. It is the workers' state that gives us the right to affirm independence, which means that it can also take it away, just like they do with the liberal state does with rights and other things, or
Yeah.
treaties. The workers' state has all of the power. Due to the alignment with settler colonial definitions of the US, the weakness of language, and the lack of specificity, I think that the only reasonable thing to discern from this program is that the return of land would be through a reservation system. The PSL looks to uphold a US workers' state, therefore, it is necessary to have some system of reservations. They're going to get into it in a bit too, but I just want to pause here and talk about the fact of like, I mean, I don't know too much about PSL, but it seems like a lot of the problem, and specifically with the platform policy, and I don't know if you feel the same way, Vienno, is largely due to how they might perceive of a workers' state rather than some sort of like other forming or like I guess like the thing that I struggle with, not
How do you mean?
necessarily with this paper, but just like overall with this picture, is like the conflict comes from I think the notion that a lot of communists see themselves, and largely because it's a modernist project, of being like a universally applied thing, right? That we will all become
Mhm.
the workers' state, right? And it is therefore by necessity a overarching thing that is applied to everything, right? And I feel like that does conflict largely with a kind of like anti-colonial message, which is that you're therefore telling us that you're going to replace this thing that controlled us before with this new thing is going to control us because it's some overarching
Yeah.
system that's going to be placed upon us. But I wonder if also like part of the argument there through the PSL would be somehow the indigenous people are coming along for the ride or something. I don't actually like believe this myself as a good thing, but like I wonder if like part of that plays into their argument or something.
I mean, yeah, I would say so, probably. Like, my guess is that any response that they would have to this sort of criticism is like, we had Leonard Peltier on the ticket,
Yeah.
or, something like we have indigenous members, or something similar, which is effectively like what the Communist Party of Canada does too, where it's just like, we aren't a colonial state. Canada's not a colonial state. Lenin said we're an imperialism now. where it's like, come on. Like this doesn't even hold up under your own sort of like viewpoint. But it's also kind of like how you could have, the Bolshevik invasion of like most of the Russian Empire at the expense of like other workers' movements, where it's like, the Bolsheviks didn't really have to invade Ukraine because it was already in the hands of like Makhno and the anarchists. They didn't really have to invade Azerbaijan and Baku because it was already under the control of a local workers' party. Um, the issue there was the Soviets needed Baku's oil in order to further the war effort. So, like, one of Lenin's first things was like, fuck, like, yeah, we're disintegrating the Russian Empire, but we really need this oil. And it's just like, well, sucks to be them, I guess. They're back under Russian control.
Yeah.
And you can see it in the history of these sorts of ideologies, in the histories of these like sorts of, I guess, yeah, like universalists. You can see it, with the French Revolution, where it's like, oh yeah, the rights of man and blah 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 blah, and like free the slaves, but oh right, we are gonna invade Haiti again though.
Yeah.
We do need that sugar in like that sugar colony, please.
Or you have the right to self-determination so long as it's the determination that we like.
Yeah, exactly.
It's it's just complicated too, like by the fact of like I don't know. There's something about you. You almost I don't feel like you can get to in like a socialist state of any working kind through a kind of imperialism, by taking it
I
over and then applying it on top.
I think you could have ended it earlier by saying, I don't think you can get to a socialist state.
Okay, well,
That's kind of the end
I
of
was
it,
using I
right?
was using
Like,
state a bit more broadly than that, and not
okay, yeah,
like a state of
but I
time
think
or
that
place.
is what it calls into question.
Yeah,
Is like, you know, yeah, you can't get into a socialist state through imperialism, but the state is reliant on that to like exist.
right.
So the answer is the destruction of the state. Like,
Yeah, yeah.
um, where like, yeah, like you can't really have
I
a
this is my own thing. I hate the word state, and part of that is like through my philosophical work that I did, which like state just means like a time or place. You know what I mean? Like we're here, not like
so
a
we're getting rid of
governing.
that too.
Yeah. So well, there's states always. You can't get rid of states. It's like there's this is the state of this program right now. This Twitch stream.
Nope, it is not. I reject that. Aufheben.
Yeah.
Um,
Negation.
exactly. We are negating the state in the sense
Yeah.
of time and place. Death to clock time, death to the ability to differentiate between one place and another.
Uh, that's my only always confusion with the word state. I almost never use it in terms of like these United States kind of language, or like the state of Canada in terms of like the governing body. Uh, I have to somehow correct that. I realize it's mostly
Fucking
my deficiency.
philosophers.
Yeah, it happens. I will continue.
Shout out to Elrond. We hate philosophers here.
Most other communist parties, organizations, or groups uphold a similar.
I'll be right back. I need to go pee.
Do you want me to hold off then?
I'll just turn it up on my phone and I'll be able to listen to you read. So just like read a paragraph or two, or if you need to pause, have fun. I guess talking.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll see. Okay, I'll be right back.
Most other communist parties, organizations, or groups uphold a similar line, no matter the tendency. The lines are stated in different ways and different reasons, are given for the survival of a USSA. I do like this notion of a USSA, the United Socialist States of America, rather than the USSR. I don't wish to talk about all these different ways in which communists would like to uphold a USSA because not a single party, organization, or group has any specific plan on how they would uphold a USSA but ensure indigenous sovereignty. Furthermore, we are looking at law here. For this reason, we will recognize that all of these lines are reactionary in that they seek to uphold settler colonialism, for settler colonialism cannot be destroyed but through the destruction of the United States in any form. And we will move on to law. We recognize that the vast majority of large and established communist parties in the US would have to continue the legal reality of domestic dependent nationhood under the settler colonial worker state. How would it do that? Right? So it's saying that the socialist state necessarily is going to have to keep doing what the liberal state was already doing through its legal system in enforcing colonization, settler colonialism. The first work of action by a USSA would be to revert all negative language within the phrase domestic dependent nation. We would instead have an autonomous free territory or something similar. Autonomous free territories will no longer be guided by the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but by the Organ of Indigenous Sovereignty, or possibly the multinational Communist Party itself. We must understand that all of these changes of name do not signify a fundamental break with any of the concepts encoded within domestic dependent nation. The reservations will still be subject to the guidance and or leadership of some overarching body subservient to the settler state, and reservations will still not be able to trade or do any other sort of diplomacy with foreign nations. Settler colonialism is left intact if a USSA is allowed to exist. If settler colonialism is left intact, its mystified form in law is left intact. So how then would the USSA claim dominion? Right? So it's going to have to perpetuate these things if it's going to somehow still rule over them. A USSA would seek to abolish capitalism, not settler colonialism. It would take all resources available to the USSA to abolish capitalism, and all resources available to a USSA would be those resources stolen from indigenous land. Let us not delude ourselves into thinking that because the US claims ownership over Coast Salish land, for example, that means it is true. Every fish taken out of a river in what we would now call the area around the Puget Sound is stolen. Those resources belong to Coast Salish people, and they are being stolen by the United States. Indigenous people fight for our resources and sovereignty. Indeed, this is why the fish wars were fought by Coast Salish people in the 60s and 70s. We look to end settler colonialism and claim our resources for ourselves, so that we may determine their correct and well thought out distribution to ourselves and settlers. But for communists who support a USSA, this conclusion is not reasonable. The only reasonable claim is that of a USSA in which a settler colonial proletarian state determines what to do with the resources it steals. In this way, we see the social settlers have arrived back at the reasoning of De Vittoria, not breaking from modernity / coloniality and liberalism at large. Let us quote from him once again. So we'll get to the quote in a second. I did want to say, like, this is where I wish I had more of a reading into current writings on, I guess, post-colonialism or anti-colonialism stuff. Because part of me is like, how does this work out in the sense of we've now gone beyond the state, we've abolished state, the land is sort of returned, and so there is no longer like these other nations that exist. How would they interact with the rest of the people who are still here, or how does that relationship work?
I mean, I think the easiest way of thinking about it is to refer back to like the Turo Wampum, where it's like we all exist on this land together, and like the things that we do are take from it what we need, but also make sure that there is always enough for whoever else is on this land. Like,
Yeah, I mean, like, there's I mean, the only thing that I can see with that has more to do with just like things we know about, like the tragedy of the commons. Like, how do we? But I mean, we're also talking about a state, like we've now abolished states. Like we might have a better structured society in the sense that we don't need to worry about certain aspects of greed and other stuff.
yeah,
Yeah, no, that's fair.
yeah, like it's a means of like sharing the land in a more like direct democracy type of
Yeah.
way is, I think, an easier way to phrase it for like, I guess, like settler brains, like where it's, you want a framing that is within your ideological kind of like wording, where it's,
I don't think.
you look at the, sorry,
Or so no, you finish your thought.
it was gonna be a tangent, so you go first, and then I'll go on my tangent.
Yeah, no, mine was just more of like I don't know. It was more in the context of this paper, which clearly it wasn't designed to go this further step that I'm taking it, but just in the sense of like,
Mhm.
were they arguing that the existing nations that would remain, uh, that get their land given back to them, would they resemble the a state or not? Right, state in the sense that I was using it wrongly, like in the way that Marxists tend to use the word state, right? So would it resemble a state, or would it be like how you described, more of like, uh, what did you call it? Kind of like more democracy. I can't remember the exact wording.
I said like a direct
Direct democracy.
democracy.
Yes, that's kind of where I was getting at. Which it's like it doesn't spell it out here, but nor is this paper designed to spell that out. I was more just curious.
Yeah, like, did I give you Nick Estes's Our Histories of the Future?
That sounds very familiar, but I have not read it. If you did give it to me.
Okay. I have an EPUB of it, at least, if I didn't give you a physical copy. But
No, I
that
don't.
it kind of gets into it, and he's, I don't know, he's a little bit weird sometimes, in the sense that, like, despite being like an indigenous communist, sometimes he goes on like weird like pro China side things on Twitter. Um but like, he gets kind of into those like discussions of like indigenous nationalisms in the like 70s, especially, in the book, and it's really, I think it helps kind of like frame that really well, and it's
Awesome.
just like a fucking amazing book. um
Yeah, again, this is why I flagged right up front. I'm not familiar with like more recent writings on this, so
yeah,
something to do in the future.
yeah. um yeah, like, my tangent now
Yeah,
was kind of like, it, there are so many like sort of ideological phrase mongerings, I guess, that like everybody of whatever ideologies or whatever just like really,
like those
like
phrases.
sometimes like you'll have, yeah, like you'll have Marxists or anarchists or Maoists or whoever else kind of like arguing over one another because they're saying a phrase that for them means one thing, but for a different ideology means a different thing, that like whatever, whatever, whatever. Where it's like, when we're talking about sovereignty, in the case of indigenous people, we're not talking about like a ethno-national
Yeah, yeah,
sovereignty. Like, we're talking about relations with the land and everything that exists on it. Um, or yeah, like where it's talking about like, giving land back, or when it's talking about, when anarchists and Marxists talk about like the state, or like stupid concepts like authoritarianism or like whatever other bullshit, where it's like they're just going to talk over one another because they have different definitions of these things or use different phrases that mean kind of the same thing, but they'll never admit that type of thing. Um,
That kind of point that you said there too, like reminded me of like when I was saying earlier about and we got caught up on like the term state in terms of like you can't uh you can't have socialism by like having a kind of like imperial taking over of the people and making them socialist in that sense. And part of that is I think is because there is a sense of like autonomy. Like it's almost like you want people to be able to like feel like they willingly chose to go to this to a certain extent. Like I don't think you can get that if you just take over a group of people and be like, you're now doing X. Uh, I don't know if there's a tons of writing on that, but like to me, it just seems like I can imagine like any people being like, you came in here, like I was doing a thing, like maybe you have the right decision, like you can tell it to us, but did you have to take us over and like force this on us? It feels like that would cause
yeah.
more problems than I don't know, telling people about it and hoping that they make the right choices.
Um,
Right choices,
there's
presuming
that.
that like your idea of whatever the world should be is correct.
Yeah. Um, there's something kind of along those lines in that what was the USSR book by, funny enough, by the Aufheben Collective, um,
Negation.
uh, where yeah, the Negation Collective is such a fucking cool title. But where it was talking about like, okay, like sure, whatever, like if we're to talk about like the Soviet Union and say like, oh, it was legitimately a worker state or whatever, um, and maybe it degenerated, which is what like Trotsky's argument was that like the Soviet Union was a degenerated worker state. Then how do you apply that after um, the conversion, I suppose, of the Eastern Bloc to so-called socialism? They didn't have a workers' revolution. They didn't have, any of these sort of things. It was like, you can't really have a workers' state or like a revolutionary workers' state imposed upon you type
Yeah.
of thing. And that was what kind of like helped settle the question of like, oh, yeah, maybe it's not a workers' state anymore. um, is like, you can't have that. That doesn't work out. You can't liberate someone else for them. They have
Yes.
to liberate themselves.
Yeah. No, I mean there's I mean that gets that I mean that can get into like all the other issues with general imperialism even like within the United States and like questions about like, pulling out of Afghanistan and all that, right? Uh where it's like, yeah, there could be in the immediate term there could be more conflict with that, but it's like you're also never going to get anywhere by imposing your system upon them. There's always going to be, and that becomes like a good recruiting tool for people who hate you. You're like, look at these people trying to control us, and now you've got like automatic like recruiting for whatever militia or anything is going to try to oppose what exists
Mm. Also, Scrublord in chat
all the
we're
way.
saying, yeah, all the way, but also like we're talking about a sort of critique of like socialist claims of anti-colonialism is kind of discussion that, or the article that we're reading right now, and like the, I guess, discussion that we're having as well. Post
We're
the
almost
article again.
Yeah, we're almost done. I'm gonna finish reading. So this is a quote again by D. Vittoria. Vittoria. These barbarians, though not
Sure.
totally mad, are nevertheless so close to being mad that they are unsuited to setting up or administering a commonwealth both legitimate and ordered in human and civil terms. It might therefore be argued that for their own benefit, the princes of Spain might take over their administration, so long as this could be proved to be in their best interest. Excuse me. These are the exact terms in which those who do not support the establishment of indigenous states think. They understand our cries for indigenous states, but they consider our liberation dangerous to settler socialist society. To act at odds with the settler proletariat is to act against the law of workers. See, I also want to say they said indigenous states. That
Hmm.
word. To act at odds with the settler proletariat is to act against the law of workers, just as to act against the conquistadors and Spanish settlers was is to act against the law of nations. And so a USSA must be set up, dominion over the land intact, in order to guide the social settler state in the correct direction. And so it would be argued that Indians, their hearts being in the right place, but not their head, would be put under the tutelage of a socialist state in some way, shape, or form to be shown how to truly build a workers' state. Perhaps the Indians are consulted on how to best distribute fish around the Puget Sound, but they don't have full control over the decision and distribution. This control is gifted to the settler state. In this way, the settler state is saved from its potential destruction and can continue on its mission to liberate the proletariat through the theft of indigenous lands and resources.
I forgot that there was a time delay. I was just like, why are you like still? Why is your mouse still like going on
Here?
these things you finished reading like 20 seconds
Oh.
ago?
I also paused bathing, so I was just reading the chat.
Yeah.
Let me repeat myself more. I mean, like this. The funny thing is, we just basically were talking about this, and they said pretty much similar stuff.
Mhm.
Let me repeat myself more clearly. The settler state looks to liberate the proletariat from capitalism by using settler colonialism, while indigenous people look to liberate ourselves and others from settler colonialism by using decolonization and decoloniality. Decoloniality necessitates the destruction of modernity slash coloniality, a duality in which capitalism or economic coloniality plays an enormous role. The socialist settler state then needs to find a legal justification for its settler colonial material existence. This justification is the madness of Indians who work against the law of workers and seeking decolonization and decoloniality. Jesus, that word.
Decoloniality.
Decoloniality.
Um, just on this note, like I this is part of where it's just kind of like I don't know, it's iffy. Like it kind of buys too much into, so-called socialist states or whatever, like ability to actually escape capitalism, which
Yeah.
I think is like a bad understanding of capitalism. But it also is sort of like aimed at I don't know, it takes the PSL or like those sorts of groups kind of too much at their word on their ability to like abolish capitalism using state directed means.
Yeah. I mean, I have issues with the use of modernity here too. Only in the sense that like I don't find the usage of the word modernity or by extension post-modernity because it sounds like what they're arguing for here is some sort of like postmodernism in a way. And I often find these terms not that helpful. uh in the sense that like even though yes, Marxism is a modernist theory in the sense that it's supposed to be universally applicable or it obeys some sort of like universal laws of material reality or something like this. Uh, like I don't know if that necessarily contrasts with decolonization. You know what I mean? In part because nothing about like the state of how the world is or behaves necessitates imposing it on others, if that makes sense. It's I mean like I can see the extension between early modern thought and the idea that like we've come up with this legal framework that we then need to apply to everything, but like nothing about like certain other modernist thinkers come with that kind of baggage, you know, even though the history definitely I can understand why people reject do it that way. That makes sense.
Yeah. I don't know. It's difficult. Like even in like courses on like the study of genocide that I did in undergrad and stuff like that, where it was like it did, it talked about, sort of Germany as like the heart of modernism and as like one of the most like progressive and democratic and whatever places in the heart of Europe. And, Europe as like the heart of modernism for the world. And then like that modernism led directly to the death camps type of thing, where it was, that those sorts of logics marched us all the way there type of thing. So I don't know. I'm a lot more sympathetic to like critiques of modernism or modernity as like notions. Um Scrubblord, just don't be silly. Um but yeah, like where it is kind of I don't know, I have a lot of sympathy for the argument. I also kind of get it because like most people don't really, I think, have a good understanding of modernism or modernity.
Yeah.
So they read that word and they're just like, oh, you're make assumptions based off of that. So it's almost like a
Yeah, I can't remember.
question of like phrasing
Yeah. Well, I
again.
was gonna say like I can't remember if I made this point 2 minutes ago or not, so I might be repeating myself. But my point is more of just like I because how confused the notion of modernity and postmodernism is. Like I don't or modernism postmodernism. I just don't find it overly useful to like constantly like refer to them. In part because like nah, I'm not going to get into a whole postmodernist discussion here, but like my point is just I feel these words are often they're too overarching for the amount of I guess disparate people who like had various theories that are considered either modernist or postmodernist for the labels to accurately characterize anything like too meaningful. But I do agree with you that yes, a lot of people who we would describe as modernist did a lot of terrible shit, and it did lead to the gas chambers and other stuff, right? I would argue it also led to Marxism. So like, it's just hard uh, to weigh. I mean, like to put it all under one umbrella is just it does too much, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair. I don't know.
Uh,
I did get a little bit distracted there by
yeah,
Scrubblord
Scrubler.
saying like some long bullshit about Russia and whatever. And it's like, okay, whatever, dude. Like, I don't give a shit.
Was it? It was mod or communism bad because Soviet Russia was basically it.
Didn't even mention the Soviets specifically, just said Russia
Yeah.
and communism. But
All right,
anyways,
I'll go on. The madness of Indians denies us our ability to independence and ensures the control of indigenous land by the settler state. The settler state, recognizing its Indian problem, then seeks a way to deal with it. These solutions are reservations, autonomous territories, or whatever other wording would want to be used. Perhaps the settler state would be so reactionary that it completely eliminates reservations in their entirety and employs an assimilatory concept to integrate the Indians into wider settler proletarian culture. Possibilities are endless. The logic of elimination continues. It should be clear to see that any social settler claim over indigenous land legally falls flat on its face. The reason for this is because the material reality that law mystically represents, settler colonialism, is a genocidally oppressive condition that cannot be stopped but through surrendering the land to those from whom it was stolen. The land was stolen by settlers, and so it must be taken back. The result of this process of regaining our land is the establishment of indigenous states, and nothing short of that. The entire problem of dominion disappears once indigenous states are established because its whole reason for creation is thrown into the waste bin of US American history. Whether we are reasonable or unreasonable in the eyes of communists is not important. What is important is our real liberation.
that was like the weakest part of the article to me.
This last part,
Yeah,
or the
where
last
it's just like
paragraph?
the argument for indigenous states, where it's like,
Yeah.
you haven't followed your own logic here.
I mean,
Like,
that's kind of what I was getting at before, like, which is why I wanted to know what like after Landis return, like what it would look like. Like not like I agree, I
yeah,
don't want states in its place, but then if they want, I mean, like, because this is like, there's an inherent contradiction almost, because you don't want to say like, hey, you're now doing a state that's bad, and like we're now doing the exact same thing over and over again in like telling them how to live, right? But there's an also
Mm.
notion of just like, I don't know, I would hope that part of the liberation for everyone is socialism in some respects, right? So it's like,
Yeah.
I don't know, it's difficult, but I do appreciate this, and I get where it's coming from, which is that a lot of it is the still trying to think that we can just impose our ideas on other people, and I think we need to constantly have that in the forefront of our mind when we're proposing these
Yeah. And like, I guess we probably can just read it more charitably too, where it isn't really the state in the sense that we're talking about again, because there's ideological language blinders on everybody. um,
No, I mean, like,
yeah.
it's also, it's like one short article, so like I don't want to mischaracterize their position either. They're obviously not doing a philosophical discourse on what the post-colonial nation would look like for them, uh,
Mm.
but I still think we need to give land back, regardless. You know,
Yeah.
so it's
No, like, end of the day, it's one of those, like, the critiques of current socialist parties and their notions of, like, anti-colonialism is still very correct. Like, they're coming from a place of, like, I don't know, being right. They have a good critique, I guess, of... And this is, you know, the critique is more the focus of the article rather than, like, what can be drawn, I guess, positively from it. It's a negative critique,
yes,
not a, like,
it's an Aufheben.
positive critique, I suppose. Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, Aufheben, the colonial state.
I mean, yeah, and it's one where, like, you know, we have seen it in our own contexts here in Canada. So this, it's good that they're doing this in order to show like this is something that exists within socialist movements, and we need to be very aware of it. You know, even if we don't necessarily ascribe to the sort of like status thing that maybe the PSL ascribes to,
Mm.
or our own Communist Party of Canada. So again, that was that article. Listen, I mean, I don't know. The funny thing is, when I first moved here, had started making friends and had tons of friends in the Communist Party of Canada, and now I think they've all left.
When we met, I was affiliated with them. Like,
Yeah, but you were only in the Young Communists. Like, were you? Were you?
I mean, but
They're affiliated, but yeah.
yeah, that's why I said affiliated,
Okay.
not like a member.
Hello, my rebels. Hello, my rebels. I'm a good boy. I'm a weirdo.